Imagine a world where America never gained independence, where the British flag still flies over New York, where people sip overpriced tea without protest, and where every school kid has to memorize 57 different kings and queens. Sounds weird, right? But what's even weirder is how the actual Battle of Yorktown played out. In 1781, after 6 long years of brutal fighting, the American Revolution was at a breaking point. Both sides were exhausted, resources were stretched thin, and Britain still believed it could crush the rebellion once and for all. But in a stunning reversal of fate, George Washington and his allies pulled off one of the greatest military maneuvers in history, trapping a massive British army and forcing them to surrender. This wasn't just any victory, it was the victory. The one that made King George III sit up in his chair and say, "Wait, we lost?" The one that made the British Parliament realise that continuing the war wasn't just expensive, it was pointless. But here's the real twist. Yorktown wasn't even supposed to happen. Washington originally planned to attack New York. So how did the war's biggest battle end up in Virginia instead? How did 16,000 American and French soldiers outmaneuver the world's most powerful empire? And why did British General Cornwallis come up with the weakest excuse ever to skip his own surrender? This battle wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a masterclass in strategy, deception and luck. It had last-minute changes, a secret 400-mile march, a perfectly timed naval blockade, and even a storm that ruined the British escape plan. If even one of these things had gone differently, history might have taken an entirely different course. Welcome to Infinitia Verity, where we don't just tell history, we bring it to life. If you love history, told with strategy, humor, and just the right amount of chaos, then buckle up, because this is going to be a wild ride. By the end of this video, you'll see the American Revolution in a whole new way. So stick around, because trust me, you don't want to miss this. It's 1781. The American Revolution has been raging for 6 long, bloody years. Soldiers on both sides are tired, supplies are running low, and neither side has landed a knockout punch. The war was supposed to be over quickly, at least that's what the British thought when it all started. But now it's turned into a slow, costly grind. So where does everyone stand? The British Empire, once thought to be invincible, was now stuck in a war that refused to end. They controlled key cities like New York, Savannah and Charleston, but the countryside? That was a whole different story. The British army was powerful but stretched too thin. The war was becoming increasingly unpopular in Britain. Parliament was getting sick of spending money on a war with no end in sight. Loyalist support in the colonies was fading. The British had hoped American loyalists would rise up to help them, but instead guerrilla warfare, supply shortages and constant ambushes made holding territory nearly impossible. At the centre of Britain's southern campaign was General Charles Cornwallis, one of Britain's top military leaders, and he had a huge problem. Cornwallis had been fighting a brutal war in the south, winning battles but struggling to control the region. His plan: move north to Virginia, set up a stronghold at Yorktown, and wait for the British Navy to resupply and reinforce his troops. In theory, it was brilliant. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen, because he had no idea that George Washington and his allies were about to pull off the biggest military maneuver of the entire war. The Continental Army was outgunned, underfunded, and constantly short on supplies. Washington's men had been fighting a war of survival for years, relying on quick strikes, strategic retreats, and pure grit. They had never been able to win a truly decisive battle that could end the war once and for all. Washington knew that one more stalemate wouldn't cut it. He needed to trap and destroy a major British force, and Yorktown was the perfect opportunity. By 1781, the French had officially joined the war, sending troops, supplies, and most importantly, a navy. Without the French, the war probably would have ended in British victory. The French commander, General Rochambeau, and Washington hatched a plan so bold it had almost no chance of working, except somehow it did. The plan tricked the British into thinking the Americans were attacking New York. Secretly march 400 miles south to Yorktown, surround Cornwallis before he even realizes what's happening, block his escape by land and sea. If it worked, the war could be over in a matter of weeks. If it failed, the American Revolution could collapse, and so the biggest gamble of the war was about to begin. Picture this, you're General Cornwallis. You've spent months fighting a brutal war in the south. You're exhausted. Your men are exhausted. You decide to set up camp in a nice, quiet, coastal town called Yorktown where you can rest and wait for reinforcements. What you don't realize is that you've just walked into the biggest trap of the entire war. And by the time you figure it out, it's already too late. Here's how the Americans and French turned Yorktown into a death trap. One of the biggest mistakes Cornwallis made was assuming the British Navy would come to his rescue. But the Americans had a new secret weapon, the French fleet, led by Admiral de Grasse. On September 5th, 1781, a massive naval battle erupted off the coast of Virginia between the British and French fleets. After hours of intense fighting, the British fleet was forced to retreat, and the French took control of Chesapeake Bay. Why does this matter? Because Cornwallis had just lost his escape route. No supplies, no reinforcements, just him and his 7,000 men stuck in Yorktown. Meanwhile, Washington and Rochambeau were pulling off one of the biggest tricks in military history. The British expected Washington to attack New York. After all, it was the biggest British stronghold in America. So Washington did something genius. He pretended to attack New York, setting up fake camps, sending misleading letters, and even building dummy fortifications. The British commander in New York, General Clinton, fell for it completely. Then overnight, Washington's army disappeared. Instead of marching to New York, they were heading 400 miles south to Yorktown. By the time the British realized what was happening, Washington was already halfway there. Washington, Rochambeau, and 16,000 American and French troops marched for weeks, covering nearly 20 miles a day. Soldiers dragged cannons, supplies, and heavy artillery across the rugged countryside. The heat, exhaustion, and endless marching took a toll, but no one was turning back. By the end of September, the entire American-French force had arrived. Cornwallis, still clueless. By September 28th, Washington had completely surrounded Yorktown. On one side, 16,000 American and French troops. On the other side, the French Navy, blocking the British escape route. Cornwallis had just walked into the worst possible situation. He still believed the British Navy would come to save him, but the reality, no one was coming. The Americans were about to strike, and once they did, there would be no turning back. The trap was set. The British were surrounded. The Americans and French had the numbers, the firepower, and the determination to end the war. But Cornwallis still had one last hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive. But what happened next? Well, let's just say things didn't go according to plan. The siege of Yorktown officially began on October 9th when Washington gave the order to fire, and once the first cannon was fired, it never stopped. The American and French forces unleashed a relentless artillery assault on British positions. Day and night, cannons fired continuously, pounding the British fortifications into dust. Cornwallis and his men were trapped inside Yorktown, forced to watch as their defences were obliterated. One British soldier later wrote, "The whole peninsula trembled under the continual blast of cannon fire. It was as if hell itself had opened upon us. Hundreds of shells rained down every hour. British soldiers had no way to fight back. They could only take cover and hope for a miracle." But here's the thing. Miracles don't happen when your enemy outnumbers and outguns you. After days of non-stop bombardment, the British defences were crumbling. Cornwallis had to do something. Cornwallis still refused to surrender. So Washington decided to speed things up. He set his sights on two key British defensive positions, redoubts 9 and 10. The plan? The French would attack redoubt 9. The Americans would attack redoubt 10. The assault would take place at night, silent, brutal, and fast. Washington personally chose his best troops for the job, including Alexander Hamilton. Yes, that Hamilton. American soldiers charged the fortifications with bayonet. No time to reload, no time for hesitation. Hand-to-hand combat erupted as they climbed over the British defences. Hamilton's men stormed through the trenches, fighting in brutal close-quarters combat. Within 10 minutes, Redoubt 10 fell. The French attack on Redoubt 9 was just as brutal. The French troops, led by General de Viomenil, faced fierce resistance. But after a bloody battle, they captured Redoubt 9 as well. By morning, Cornwallis had lost his last line of defence. Washington's men could now bring their artillery even closer. It was only a matter of time. Cornwallis had one last desperate plan: escape. He ordered his men to abandon Yorktown and cross the York River to safety. If they could regroup, maybe they could fight another day. But then, the weather intervened. A massive storm suddenly hit Yorktown. The boats were torn apart. Half the men never even made it across. Cornwallis's last hope was gone. With no way out, no reinforcements, and no defences left, Cornwallis had no choice. The next morning he sent a messenger to Washington. The British were surrendering. The American Revolution was over. Cornwallis refused to attend his own surrender. He claimed he was sick. Instead, he sent his second-in-command, who handed over his sword to Washington's second-in-command. It was the ultimate humiliation. The British army marched out in silence, playing the song "The World Turned Upside Down." Because that's exactly what had happened. The greatest empire on earth had just been defeated by a group of rebels. October 19th, 1781, the day the British Empire lost America, the day an entire army laid down its weapons and surrendered. But Yorktown wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of something much, much bigger. So what happened next? Let's break it down. Cornwallis's surrender sent shockwaves through Britain. News travelled slowly in the 18th century, but when it reached London, panic. The British government had been struggling to justify the war for years. Suddenly, with an entire army captured, continuing the fight looked, well, really, really bad. The war was now politically unwinnable. Public support in Britain collapsed. Even King George III, who had been determined to crush the rebellion, started reconsidering. One member of Parliament, upon hearing the news, famously threw his hands up and said, "Oh God, it is all over." And he was right. Though fighting continued in smaller battles for another year, the British knew it was over. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially ending the war. Britain recognized the United States as an independent nation. After nearly a decade of war, the American colonies were no longer colonies. They were free. But that was just the beginning. Yorktown wasn't just the end of the war, it was the spark that ignited revolutions across the world. France, inspired by America's success, the French Revolution erupted just a few years later in 1789. Haiti, the first successful slave revolution in history, happened in 1791, inspired by the American struggle for freedom. Latin America. Throughout the 19th century, nations like Mexico, Venezuela, and Argentina fought their own wars of independence. What happened at Yorktown wasn't just an American victory, it was a global turning point. It proved that a determined underdog army could defeat the world's greatest superpower. It cemented Washington's legacy as one of the greatest military leaders in history. And it created the United States, a nation that would soon reshape the world. But here's the question, what if Yorktown never happened? What if Cornwallis had escaped? Would America have still won its independence? The war could have dragged on for years, and history might have taken a very different path. One thing is certain, Yorktown was one of the most decisive battles in history. And there you have it, the Battle of Yorktown, the moment that changed history forever. What started as a bold gamble turned into one of the most decisive victories ever recorded. Washington and his allies pulled off a masterstroke of strategy, trapping Cornwallis and forcing Britain's hand. But here's the thing, Yorktown wasn't supposed to be the final battle. If even one part of this plan had failed, the French Navy losing, the deception failing, or Cornwallis escaping, the war could have continued for years. The United States might not have been born in 1783. Maybe not at all. That's what makes Yorktown so fascinating. It was a battle of timing, planning, and just the right amount of luck, and in the end it became the defining moment that gave America its independence. Now let's hear from you. What do you think? If the French never helped, could the Americans have won? Was Cornwallis truly outplayed, or did he just get unlucky? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you love history broken down with strategy, humor, and a bit of chaos, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We have more incredible stories coming your way, from ancient empires to modern wars, because history is never boring when you know where to look. This is Infinitia Verity, where history comes alive. See you next time. And remember, those who don't learn history are doomed to, well, at least we can laugh at it. This is Infinitia Verity, where history gets a little more animated.